The day Ruby Brenner walked into the Malone ranch with nothing but a leather satchel, a dead husband's unpaid debts, and enough pride to fill the whole of the Arizona territory, was the day everything changed for both of them, though neither one knew it yet. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory was still a rough and restless place. The railroad had pushed its iron fingers westward, bringing settlers and speculators and men with more ambition than sense, and behind all of them came the reckoning of land and livestock, and who owed what to whom. The Malone Ranch sat on 12,000 acres of red dust range land south of Tucson, a sprawling empire of cattle and horses and hard-won grass that the Malone family had built over 3 difficult decades. It was the biggest operation in the territory by most accounts, employing 42 cowboys, a cook, a blacksmith, a horse doctor, and a general manager by the name of Harrison Cross, who liked to remind anyone who would listen that he had once shaken hands with a senator. Ruby Brenner did not care about senators. She had ridden the 12 miles from the small homestead she had shared with her husband Thomas into town on a borrowed horse, because the horse Thomas had left her was too old to make the full trip and back on the same day. Thomas had been dead 6 weeks. He had died of a fever that came on fast and took him in 4 days, leaving Ruby with a half-built house, 60 acres of clay soil, a small herd of cattle she did not entirely know how to manage, and a debt that had been quietly growing like a weed in the back of a garden nobody checked. The debt was owed to the Malone Ranch. Thomas Brenner had borrowed a breeding bull from the Malones 2 years prior under a contract that stipulated payment in kind, a percentage of the calves born that season, and he had paid the first year's portion faithfully. The second year had been bad. Drought came through, and the calves were undersized and several did not survive the summer, and Thomas had gone to the Malone foreman and asked for more time. He had been given it, in writing, with interest. By the time Thomas died, the debt had grown to a figure that made Ruby's stomach go hollow when she first read it written on paper. She could not pay it in cash. She did not have cash. What she had was cattle. 31 head, mixed quality, some good and some merely acceptable. She had counted them twice herself to be sure. And she had walked to the Malone Ranch gate with her chin up, and her black dress still carrying the particular stiffness of mourning garments worn too often in too short a time, and she had asked to speak with whoever handled the business of the ranch. The gate hand, a young fellow named Eli who could not have been more than 19, had looked at her with wide eyes and run off to find someone. He came back with Harrison Cross. Cross was a compact man in his late 40s with a wide mustache and the permanent squint of someone who spent a great deal of time calculating things and not quite liking the numbers. He wore a good vest and carried a ledger under his arm like a weapon. He looked Ruby up and down with the practiced efficiency of a man who had decided things about people before they opened their mouths. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, because Eli had apparently told him her name. "I'm sorry for your loss." He did not sound particularly sorry. "Thank you," Ruby said. "I'm here about the debt my husband owed the ranch. I'd like to settle it." Cross opened his ledger. He had clearly already consulted it. "The current balance, with the extended terms your husband negotiated, stands at the equivalent value of 38 head of healthy 2-year-old cattle, or the cash equivalent of $412. Ruby had known the number. Seeing it spoken out loud by a man with a ledger was still something different. "I have 31 head," she said. "Mixed ages but all healthy. I've had them assessed by the veterinarian in town and they're in good condition." Cross looked at her the way a banker looks at a smaller number than he was hoping for. 31 does not equal 38. "No, it does not," Ruby agreed. But the drought that caused the shortfall was the same drought that drove down land prices and cattle values across the territory. The Malone Ranch was not the only operation that took losses in 1880. "I'd like to ask for a fair assessment of what 31 good healthy cattle are worth against the terms of the debt, given the circumstances." Cross was already shaking his head. "The terms are the terms, Mrs. Brenner. I don't have the authority to renegotiate the contracts of the ranch." Then I'd like to speak with whoever does. There was a pause. Cross did not like the pause. He shifted his ledger to his other arm and looked past Ruby at nothing in particular. Mr. Malone Sr. passed 2 years ago. The ranch is managed by the family. Which member of the family handles contracts? Another pause. That would be Abel. She had not heard the name Abel Malone before that morning. Later, she would think about that, about how a person who would come to matter so completely could exist on the edge of your world without your knowledge for years and years, close enough to reach if you'd only turned the right direction. Cross sent Eli off again, and Ruby waited in the yard. It was a fine morning, cool still from the night before, the kind of Arizona spring morning that made you understand why people came here despite everything. The sky was enormous and clean, and so blue it seemed almost loud. The ranch yard itself was an organized operation, horses in one corral, a separate pen for the cutting horses, a long bunkhouse along the eastern fence line, a smithy with its fire already going, and the main house set back on a small rise, built wide and low in the territorial style with a covered porch running the full length of its front. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, his footsteps, long and unhurried on the hard-packed earth, the kind of walk that belongs to a man who knows the land under his feet like he knows the back of his own hand. Abel Malone came around the corner of the equipment barn, and Ruby turned and looked at him. And she had the strange sensation that occurs sometimes when you meet someone and some quiet part of your mind simply notes them down with a kind of permanent attention. He was 32 years old, tall, with the sun-darkened skin, and the particular combination of lean muscle and worn-in ease that comes from growing up on working land. He had dark hair going a little long at the collar, brown eyes that were currently doing the careful work of reading a situation before he stepped into it, and he was wearing the plain working clothes of a man who had already been in the saddle that morning: dusty boots, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He was not what Ruby had expected from the son of the biggest ranch in the territory. She had expected something a little more like Harrison Cross. A little more vest and ledger. Abel Malone stopped a few feet away and took off his hat. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, "I'm Abel Malone. I apologize I wasn't here when you arrived. Harrison told me you've come about the Brenner contract." "I have," Ruby said. "I'd like a fair price on 31 head of cattle against the debt." His eyes were direct and not unkind. "Tell me about the cattle," she told him. She had done her homework. She had notes in her satchel, dates of birth for each animal she knew, weights estimated by the veterinarian, a description of their condition. She had not come to the biggest ranch in the territory unprepared. Abel listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Cross was already hovering at a distance, looking like a man waiting to veto something. When she finished, Abel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the middle distance in the way of someone doing mathematics they actually care about getting right. Then he looked back at her. "The drought in 1880 reduced the average value of territorial cattle by roughly 12%, he said. "If we apply that adjustment to the original contract terms, and account for the fact that the breeding bull was returned in good health at the end of the loan period, the adjusted value of the debt sits closer to 32 head than 38. Cross made a small sound of protest. Abel did not look at him. Ruby felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "Your manager told me the terms are the terms." "Terms are a ceiling," Abel said, "not necessarily a floor. A fair price accounts for circumstances. You didn't create the drought, Mrs. Brenner. Your father's ranch didn't either." He almost smiled. "No, but we're larger and we survived it better, and that matters when you're deciding what fair looks like." They stood there for a moment in the morning sunshine, and Ruby understood that she was being given something that she hadn't fully expected, someone willing to actually think about it. "I have 31 head, she said. "If the adjusted debt is 32, I'm still one short." "You are," he said. He looked at her steadily. "Come inside. Let me look at the original contract with fresh eyes before we settle anything." Cross followed them both into the ranch office, a practical room off the main house, with maps pinned to the walls and a big oak desk covered in papers. And Ruby sat in a straight-backed chair and watched Abel Malone read through her dead husband's contract, with the kind of attention that told her he was reading it for the first time rather than relying on what Cross had summarized for him. He asked her 2 questions during this process. He made a note. He set the paper down. The contract specified calves from the breeding season, he said, not cattle generally. Your husband's herd is mixed stock, and some of what you have are animals he owned before the loan agreement. Technically, the debt is confined to the proceeds of that breeding season, less allowances for losses attributable to the drought conditions that were documented in the territorial land records. He turned the paper toward her and pointed to a clause near the bottom. It was written in small, careful script. Ruby read it. She had read the contract before, but she had not been a lawyer and she had not been looking for this particular phrasing. That reduces the amount, she said carefully. It does, Abel said. Significantly, if we do this correctly. Cross put his hands flat on the desk. Abel, the standard practice of this ranch. The standard practice of this ranch is fair dealing, Abel said, and his voice was still easy, but there was something in it that closed the conversation. That was my father's way and it's mine. Sit down, Harrison. Cross sat down. It took them another hour to work through the specifics. Ruby had brought all her records and she was precise and organized, and Abel was thorough without being tedious about it. By the end, they had arrived at a figure that her 31 cattle would more than cover, with a small balance in her favor that Abel said could be settled in feed grain from the ranch stores, which she could use for the remainder of her herd through the coming summer. Ruby sat back in her chair when the papers were signed and felt the full weight of what had just happened. 6 weeks of cold, sick worry lifting off her shoulders all at once. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in a way that came from somewhere deep and quiet. Abel looked at her across the desk. You did your homework, he said. That helped. A lot of people come in here without their records and then the numbers are harder to argue. I had to know what I was walking into. You knew more than most. They regarded each other for a moment. Cross was already standing up and gathering papers with the stiff efficiency of a man who had lost a small battle and was not going to let it show any more than necessary. Ruby stood and collected her satchel and put out her hand. Abel stood and shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, and the handshake lasted 1 second longer than purely business required, and neither of them said anything about that. She went out into the afternoon sun, which had grown strong since morning, and walked to where the borrowed horse was tied at the rail. She was untying the reins when she heard steps behind her. It was Abel carrying a cloth sack. Feed grain like we discussed, he said. Enough to last until June. We have a wagon going north past your property day after tomorrow. They can drop it at your gate. Ruby looked at the sack. It was more than symbolic. That wasn't in the agreement. It's in the spirit of it, he said, and it's the right thing. She looked at him for a moment in the bright afternoon light. Up close in the full sun, he had the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. Not conventionally handsome in any simple way, but honest, with the small evidence of weather and work and something that might have been a long season of grief of his own written quietly around his eyes. She thought about asking him what that grief was. She didn't. It was too early, and she was still wearing black, and this was a business transaction. Thank you, Mr. Malone, she said. Abel, he said. Please. She swung up onto the borrowed horse and looked down at him. He was holding his hat at his side, the Arizona sun full on his face, squinting up at her with something that she could not quite name but that she tucked away in the back of her mind to think about later when she was alone. Ruby, she said, and rode. She thought about him on the ride home. She thought about the way he had read the contract. She thought about what he had said to Harrison Cross. The standard practice of this ranch is fair dealing. She thought about the feed grain on its way to her gate. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was the particular softness that comes when someone is unexpectedly kind to you during a hard season of your life. She had lost Thomas 6 weeks ago, and she was still bruised all through, and she needed to be careful about what she let herself feel. But she thought about him anyway. The feed grain arrived day after tomorrow, as promised, on a wagon driven by a young cowboy named Pete who had a friendly gap-toothed smile and helped her stack the bags in the linta without being asked. He also brought a note, folded small, that he handed her with an air of careful neutrality that suggested he had been instructed to be casual about it. She unfolded it after he had driven away. It said, "If the cattle need looking at before the drive, our horse doctor is available on Thursdays. Send word to the ranch and I'll arrange it. A. Malone." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of the small desk in what she was still getting used to calling simply her bedroom rather than theirs. She wrote back the next day, just 4 lines saying that the cattle were in good condition and she had no need of the horse doctor, but she was grateful for the offer. She signed it Ruby Brenner, and then after a moment's thought she added a 5th line. The feed grain was generous. Thank you. His response came in 3 days, brought again by gap-toothed Pete, who was beginning to seem like a very cheerful courier. This note said, "I'm glad the grain arrived well. If you find yourself in need of anything for the spring drive, the ranch has equipment available to neighbors. It is no trouble." Below that, and in slightly different handwriting, as if it had been added after the original note was composed, was a single line. "I hope the ride home was easier than the road in." Ruby sat at her kitchen table and looked at that last line for a long time. It was such a small thing to say. And it was somehow the truest kind of kindness, the kind that notices you without making a display of the noticing. She found reasons to ride toward the Malone ranch over the following weeks. She told herself they were practical reasons, and some of them were. She needed to confirm the terms of the cattle drive, since several of her animals would go south with the main Malone herd as part of the settlement arrangements. She needed to inquire about a stretch of the southern fence line that abutted Malone land. She needed to ask about the shared water rights along the creek that ran between their properties. These were all real concerns. They were also all things she could have sent Pete back with a note about, and she did not. The 3rd time she rode to the ranch, she arrived in the early afternoon and found the yard in the particular organized chaos of branding day. The air smelled of fire and cattle and dust, and there were cowboys moving in the efficient, slightly dangerous dance of the work, and in the middle of it all was Abel Malone, rope in hand, working alongside his men with the ease of a man who had grown up doing exactly this and never developed the habit of watching from the fence while others worked. He saw her and came over, pulling off his gloves. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, and then caught himself. "Ruby, sorry habit. Harrison Cross is formal about everything, and it gets into the way you talk. I imagine managing him requires a certain formality," she said. Abel laughed. It was a good laugh, sudden and genuine, and it changed his face completely. "That's a very diplomatic way to put it." She told him about the fence question. He listened and then called over a cowboy named Walt and gave instructions for a survey to be done, and the fence problem addressed within the week, which happened with such efficiency that Ruby found herself thinking about it as evidence of character. The way a man ran his operation told you a great deal about him. She stayed an hour that day. They sat on the porch of the main house and drank coffee, real coffee, which was a luxury Ruby had been rationing since Thomas died, and talked about the spring conditions and the price of beef in Tucson, and the new telegraph line that was supposed to reach as far as the smaller towns by the end of the year. They talked about practical things. They talked about things that mattered in 1882 in the Arizona Territory. At some point, without entirely planning to, they began to talk about other things. He told her that his father had died 2 years ago and his mother the year before that, and that he had a younger sister named Clara, who had married a man in California and wrote letters, but did not come back to the territory. He told her that he had been running the ranch alone for 2 years, and that he found the administration of it satisfying in some ways and lonely in others. And he said that last word in the straightforward way of someone who has decided to stop lying to themselves about it. Ruby told him about Thomas. She told him about the fever, the 4 days, the way it had been sudden enough that she had still not quite absorbed the permanence of it. She told him that Thomas had been a good man who had made some unwise financial decisions out of optimism rather than foolishness, and that she did not regret the life they had built even if it had left her in a complicated position. "He sounds like someone worth grieving," Abel said. "He was," Ruby said. They were quiet for a moment and the ranch sounds went on around them, normal and uncomplicated, and the sun moved a few degrees toward the horizon. "What are you going to do?" Abel asked. Not what does a widow do, not you should consider your options, but what are you going to do addressed to her specifically as someone with a plan. "Work it," Ruby said. "The 60 acres is clay, but it's not bad clay. If I can get through the next summer, I think I can turn a small profit by fall. The cattle are in better shape than the debt figures made them seem. I know what I'm doing mostly. The parts I don't know I'm learning." He looked at her steadily. "You are," he said. "I can see that." She rode home in the long gold light of the late afternoon, and she did not pretend anymore, not even to herself, that the fence question had been the whole reason she came. The weeks passed and turned into a month, and then 2 months, and the visits became a regular thing that both of them acknowledged to the extent of anticipating them, but never directly discussed. Abel found reasons of his own to ride in her direction. He came one Tuesday in May with 2 of his cowboys to help reinforce her north fence line, which had been damaged in a spring storm, and he said it was because the Malone cattle sometimes drifted that way and it was in his interest to keep the fence solid. And Ruby let him say that because it was partly true, and because she understood the particular grammar of a man who was not ready to say the fuller truth yet. She fed them all dinner after the fence work was done. She had a good kitchen and she was a good cook, and Abel ate with the appreciative focus of someone who had been eating bunkhouse food for too long. After the 2 cowboys politely made their excuses and went out to tend the horses, Ruby and Abel sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the evening was coming down blue and quiet outside the window. "This is a good home," he said. "It doesn't feel fully mine yet," she admitted. "It feels like I'm still the caretaker of something that belongs to Thomas. I don't know when that changes." "I think it changes when you let it," he said. She looked at him across the table. He was looking back at her with the same careful directness he had had that first day in the ranch office, when he had read the contract and decided that fair was the right principle. She thought that directness was perhaps the thing she liked most about him. There was no performance to it. He looked at things as they were. "Abel," she said. "Ruby," he said at the same time. They both stopped. She felt something warm move through her chest. "You first," she said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I don't want to say something that's too soon," he said. "I'm aware of what too soon looks like from the outside. But I find that I have a great deal of difficulty being in the same room as you and only talking about fences." Ruby looked at him for a long moment. Outside, one of the cowboys said something indistinct and the horse made a sound, and the evening went on being beautiful and untroubled. "Then talk about something else," she said. He did. He talked about what he had wanted to say since that first afternoon on the porch, which was that she was the most quietly impressive person he had met in a very long time, that she had walked into his ranch with her grief still on her shoulders and her logic in order and her dignity intact, and that he had not stopped thinking about her since. He said it plainly, without flourish, which was more moving than any amount of elaborate language would have been. Ruby was quiet for a moment after he finished. "I am still grieving," she said honestly. "I don't think that goes away quickly or neatly. Thomas was my husband for 4 years and I loved him and the loss is still real." "I know," Abel said. "I'm not asking you to hurry it." "I'm also not interested in pretending I don't feel what I feel," she said. "What do you feel?" She considered the question with the same care she brought to everything. "I feel like coming to your ranch about a fence problem is the best part of my week," she said. "I feel like I notice things about you that I have no practical reason to notice. I feel like when you laugh, I want to find more things to make you laugh." He smiled then, that sudden genuine smile that changed his face. "That's a good start," he said. They did not rush. They were both people who had learned, for different reasons, the value of letting things develop at their real pace rather than the pace you wished they would move. Ruby's mourning was genuine, and she honored it. She was not pretending to be further along than she was, but she also understood that grief and new feeling were not opposites, that the human heart was large enough to carry both at the same time without betraying either. Abel was patient in a way that suggested he understood this without needing it explained to him. He came on Saturdays when he could. Sometimes she rode to the ranch. They talked about everything, the cattle market and the territorial politics and the question of Arizona statehood that everyone seemed to have an opinion on, the books they had both read, the places they had both imagined going and probably never would, the small details of their separate days that became interesting only because they were being shared. Ruby met some of the cowboys and found most of them friendly in the uncomplicated way of working men, who took their cues from their employer's regard. And Abel's regard for her was clearly genuine and clearly noted. Harrison Cross was cool toward her but professionally correct, which Ruby accepted as about the best she was going to get from Harrison Cross and moved on. There was one afternoon in late June that stayed with her afterward, as the moment things shifted into something neither of them could politely call simply friendship. They had ridden out to check on a stretch of shared creek line, which was a practical errand that had by this point evolved its own light comedy of pretexts. The creek was low from the dry season, running clear and quiet between its red earth banks, and they had tied the horses in the shade of a cottonwood and walked along the bank discussing the water rights situation, which was genuinely complicated. At some point the conversation wandered away from water rights entirely, and they were just walking and talking in the late afternoon, and the cottonwoods made their particular shimmering sound in the small breeze, and Ruby was telling a story about a disastrously optimistic garden she had tried to plant in her first spring in the territory, and she was laughing at her own past self and Abel was laughing with her, and he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with announcement. He just reached out and took her hand as though it were the most natural thing, and they kept walking along the creek, and neither of them said anything about it, and they did not let go until they had to mount up to ride home. That was June. By August, the question between them was no longer whether something was happening but what shape it was going to take, and this was where things became a little more complicated and also a great deal more real. Because the ranch was the biggest in the territory, and because Abel Malone was known across 3 counties as a man of substance and standing, there was inevitably a social dimension to his life that Ruby had not thought much about until she encountered it directly. This happened at the summer gathering held at the Grantham family's property, which was the largest social event of the ranching calendar, and the sort of occasion at which everyone noticed who came with whom and what it meant. Abel asked her to come with him. Ruby stood in her kitchen when she read that note and felt the full weight of what it meant. Going with Abel Malone to the Grantham gathering was not a subtle thing. It would be a public statement. People would look at them and draw conclusions, and not all of those conclusions would be kind, because she was Thomas Brenner's widow, and some people would think 6 months was not long enough, and some people thought widow women had no business taking up with the territory's most eligible rancher, and some people simply liked disapproving of things as a general occupation. She wrote back, "Are you sure you want the talk that comes with that?" He wrote back in Pete's next delivery, "I'm not much interested in other people's talk. Come with me." She went with him. The Grantham gathering was held at a large property about 8 miles east, and the Granthams were old territorial families, meaning they were the kind of people who served real china and had opinions about propriety. Ruby wore her best dress, which was not black. She had made the deliberate decision to wear the green wool dress that Thomas had always said looked fine on her, because wearing it was its own kind of statement about moving forward. Abel met her at the gate and she noticed that he had made an effort to better coat, pressed shirt, hat brushed clean, And when he looked at her, his expression was the particular combination of admiration and relief that told her he had also been a little nervous about this. "You look beautiful," he said, which was the first time he had said anything of exactly that kind to her, and he said it with such simple directness that Ruby felt it warm all the way to her edges. "You look like you went to some effort," she said. "I went to considerable effort," he confirmed, and offered her his arm. They walked into the gathering together, and they were noticed, exactly as expected. Ruby watched the ripple of attention move through the assembled company, and kept her chin level and her expression pleasant. And Abel kept his hand at her elbow and spoke to everyone who spoke to him with his usual unhurried ease. And he did not once behave as though their being there together was anything but the most natural and correct thing in the world, which made it easier for Ruby to feel the same. There was one difficult moment, which she had expected. A woman named Harriet Bowes, who was approximately 60 and considered herself the social conscience of the territory's ranching community, took Ruby aside near the lemonade table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. "Mrs. Brenner," she said, in the tone of a woman about to deliver a kindness that was not entirely kind. "I knew Thomas. He was a decent man." "He was," Ruby agreed. "You've been widowed 6 months. 7 now." Harriet Bowes looked at Abel across the yard. "He's a good man," she said. "I will grant you that. His family built something honest here, but people talk." Ruby looked at this woman and felt, very cleanly and without anger, that she was done allowing other people's talk to define the architecture of her life. She had been quiet and careful and appropriate at every step, and she had honored her grief, and she had not rushed anything. And she was standing in a green dress next to a man who had read her dead husband's contract with more care than any stranger was required to bring to it, and she was not going to apologize for any of it. "I know people talk, Mrs. Bowes," she said pleasantly. "What they say about me says more about them than it does about me. Thank you for your concern." She walked back to Abel, who was watching her with the careful attention he brought to everything. "Everything all right?" he said. "Perfectly," she said, and took a glass of lemonade from the table. He was watching her with something she had not seen on his face before, exactly something in addition to the warmth and the interest and the careful regard. It was a look that had a kind of settling to it, as if something he had been quietly wondering about had just been confirmed. They stayed through the dinner and the dancing, and they danced together twice, which was about the maximum the territory's social conventions allowed at a public gathering between two people who had not formalized their arrangement. Ruby was a good dancer, and Abel was a better one than she expected, given that he was the kind of man who seemed more naturally comfortable on a horse than in a parlor. On the ride home, he had brought the ranch's good buggy, which was itself a statement about the occasion. The night was thick with summer stars, and the road ran silver-white through the dark desert, and they talked quietly and easily, and Ruby was aware of being completely content in a way she had not felt in a long time. At her gate, he helped her down from the buggy, and the act of stepping down brought her close to him for a moment, and in that moment he looked at her in the starlight and said, "Ruby, I want to say something, and I want to say it right." "Then say it," she said. "I know this has been its own kind of unusual situation from the start," he said. "You came to my ranch about a debt, and I was on the other side of a ledger from you, and none of that is the usual beginning. But what I feel about you has nothing to do with ledgers or debts or any of that. What I feel is—" He paused and looked out at the stars for a second, and Ruby had the impression of a man who was being more honest than he had been about this particular subject before, even to himself. "What I feel is that I love you. I have for a while now, and I haven't said it because I wanted to be sure I was saying it, and not just saying it because I was afraid you would leave if I didn't." Ruby looked at him in the silver dark. The night was warm and the stars were enormous, and the cicadas were going steadily in the brush, and she felt the truth of what she was about to say settle in her chest like something coming to rest after a long journey. "I love you too," she said. I have been in love with you since the afternoon you said the standard practice of this ranch is fair dealing, and looked at Harrison Cross until he sat down. He laughed that sudden, genuine laugh, and then he was serious again, and he reached up and touched her cheek with such gentleness that Ruby felt her throat tighten. He kissed her, once, brief and careful, with both his hands cupping her face. "Good night, Ruby," he said. "Good night, Abel," she said. She went inside and stood in her kitchen with her hands pressed to her face, and the smile that was happening to her face was not entirely dignified, and she did not care. The next weeks were the happiest she had spent in a long time, and she thought the same was true for him. There was a new ease to their time together now that the unsaid had been said, a warmth that was openly acknowledged. The cowboys who worked for Abel had apparently drawn their own conclusions weeks ago and treated Ruby with a cheerful respect that told her they approved. And old Pete, who had been their epistolary courier for months, seemed personally delighted at how things had developed, as if he had played a meaningful role in it, which Ruby supposed he had. The work of the ranch continued. Ruby's cattle had come through the spring in good condition, and her 60 acres were beginning to show the first signs of being tamed into something reliable. Abel helped when she asked for help and did not help when she did not, which was exactly the right calibration, because Ruby Brenner was not a woman who needed to be managed. One evening in September, after a long day that had included a minor crisis with a section of water pipe and a visit from the land agent about the survey of her eastern boundary, Ruby and Abel were sitting on her porch in the cooling evening, and she was tired in the good, honest way of someone who had worked hard and done it well. Abel was quiet for a while, which was comfortable with him. He could sit in silence without it feeling like absence. Then he said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for another moment. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small, something he turned in his fingers once before he spoke. "About the fact that every week when I ride back to the ranch after coming here, I spend the first hour thinking about when I can come back," he said. "And about the fact that Harrison Cross tried to tell me last week that I've been letting ranch business slide, and I told him the ranch has never run better, which is true. But the honest reason the work feels lighter is because I have something to ride back toward." Ruby looked at him in the evening light. He was looking at the small thing in his fingers, which she could see now was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small dark stone. "This was my mother's," he said. "She wore it every day of her life on this ranch, and she loved this land, and she loved my father, and she was happy. I want that." He looked up at her. "I want it with you. Ruby Brenner, will you marry me?" There it was. The thing that had been building since May, since the creek walk, since the Grantham gathering, since that first day in his office when she had sat across a desk from him and found someone who looked at things honestly. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not cry easily or make a performance of feeling. But her eyes went bright in the evening light, and she looked at Abel Malone, this steady, honest, large-hearted man who had called for fair dealing when he could have pressed his advantage, who had read a dead man's contract with care because it was the right thing to do, who had taken her hand by the creek without announcement and held it like he meant it, and she felt the full and complete correctness of the moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He put his mother's ring on her finger, and the dark stone caught the last of the evening light, and Ruby looked at it and felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, and perhaps for the first time in a different way from any time before, that the future had genuine shape and warmth and direction. He held her hand, and they sat on her porch as the stars came out over the Arizona territory, and they were happy. They married in November at the ranch, because the main house at the Malone property had a wide front parlor that could hold the people they wanted present, and the October ground was still firm enough for the outdoor celebration after. It was a simple ceremony. Ruby had no interest in elaborateness for its own sake, performed by the circuit minister, who came through the territory every 6 weeks. Harrison Cross stood in the back and maintained his professionally correct expression. The cowboys were genuinely delighted, and had cleaned their Sunday best with what was clearly sincere effort. Ruby wore a dress the color of cream, which she had made herself from fabric she ordered from the store in Tucson, and she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Abel had brought in from the west pasture that morning, without saying he was going to. When the minister asked the words and Abel said, "I do," he said it looking directly at her with his whole attention, in the way he did everything, and Ruby said, "I do" back in a voice that was clear and steady and full of the genuine thing. The celebration after went long into the evening. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had a guitar, and there was dancing in the yard by firelight, and the October night was cold and bright and beautiful. Ruby danced with Abel until her feet hurt, and then kept dancing. Old Pete looked like Christmas had come early. Even Harrison Cross unbent far enough to raise a glass, which Ruby chose to interpret as a peace offering and acknowledged with a nod that offered a reasonable future. They moved Ruby's things to the main ranch house in stages over the following weeks. This was its own kind of negotiation, how two people's separate lives arranged themselves into a shared one, and Ruby was deliberate about it without being sentimental. She brought what was hers, and she let what had been Thomas's either follow her or be given to people who could use it, and in the giving away of things, she found a kind of release she had not expected. She was not forgetting Thomas by moving forward. She was honoring the life she had lived by living the next one fully. Her 60 acres she kept in her own name. Abel had not suggested otherwise, and she had not needed to say anything about it. They discussed adding it to the ranch's operational land eventually, but under a formal arrangement that protected her ownership, and this conversation was conducted with the same directness and fairness that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. The winter was quiet in the way winters on the territory ranches were, cold at night. The cattle fed and checked daily, the shorter days spent in the domestic warmth of the house. Ruby reorganized the ranch office, which was a job that had clearly been waiting for her, and she and Abel developed the comfortable rhythms of shared life. Early mornings together over coffee while the light came up, the days divided between their respective work, evenings that belonged to each other. Harrison Cross, to his credit, adjusted. It took time and there were a few pointed exchanges, but Ruby Brenner Malone was not interested in power struggles, and she was not going to lose one. And when Cross eventually recognized this, he found his equilibrium. By spring he was bringing her the weekly accounts without being asked and addressing her with a careful respect that seemed slowly to become genuine. In February, Ruby discovered she was pregnant. She told Abel on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting by the stove in the same matter-of-fact and honest way she did most things. She said, "I think we are going to have a child, and I am glad about it, and I wanted to tell you straight." Abel looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once, all of them good, and then he stood up and came to her and crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands and said, "That is the finest news I have heard in a long time, possibly ever." She laughed. He was not often given to sentences like "possibly ever," and its presence made her certain of how much he meant it. The pregnancy was, medically speaking, uncomplicated. Ruby was strong and practical about her health, and she continued working at a modified pace, and she did not make a fuss. There was one difficult week in March when she was genuinely exhausted in a way she was not used to, and she let Abel tend to things without arguing about it, which cost her less than she expected, because he was sensible about how he helped doing what was needed without commentary. The baby was born at the end of September, with the assistance of the midwife from town and Abel in the next room in a state of barely controlled anxiety that Ruby could hear as a particular quality of silence through the wall. It was a boy. He came into the world loud and healthy and with a fine quantity of dark hair, and when they put him in Abel's arms, the expression on Abel's face was something Ruby was glad she was awake to see. They named him Henry Thomas Malone. Henry after Abel's father, and Thomas in honor of Ruby's first husband, which Abel had suggested himself and which meant more to Ruby than she entirely knew how to say. The ranch went on. The seasons turned. Henry grew. He was a laughing baby, and then a curious toddler, and then a small boy who followed his father around the yard with absolute devotion, and who had, to everyone's observation, his mother's eyes and his father's way of thinking before he spoke. The territory changed around them. Arizona statehood was still argued, but the infrastructure grew, more telegraph lines, the railroad reaching further, Tucson growing and changing, new families arriving. The Malone Ranch adapted, as it had always adapted, because Abel was a man who understood that the land itself was permanent in a way that particular arrangements of business were not, and Ruby reinforced this understanding with the long-view practical intelligence that had brought her to his door in the first place. There was a matter in 1883 that required them to stand together in a more public way than they were accustomed to. The Territorial Land Commission was reviewing water rights along several creek systems, including the one that ran between the Malone land and Ruby's 60 acres, and a land speculator from back east named Elias Drummond had filed a counterclaim suggesting that the creek's path had shifted, and the original survey was therefore invalid, which would have effectively given him control of a stretch of water that multiple small farms depended on. Drummond was the type of man who relied on other people not knowing their own records well enough to fight him, and on the commission being composed of men who were susceptible to the kind of social and financial influence that large Eastern speculators carried with them. He was not entirely wrong about the commission. Ruby had spent several evenings that winter going through every survey record, water rights document, and territorial land filing she could locate, and she had put together a case that was documented with the particular thoroughness of someone who had taught herself to be thorough because her survival depended on it. She presented it before the Land Commission in February of 1883, standing in the territorial courthouse in Tucson with Abel beside her and her notes organized on the table in front of her, and she addressed the commission with clarity and precision, and a certain quality of unflinching calm that made Drummond's lawyer, who had expected this to be a formality, visibly uncomfortable. Abel spoke to the commission as well as the primary landowner on record, and he spoke plainly and without any attempt to use his family name as leverage, which Ruby thought was both characteristically right of him and also quietly effective, because it told the commission that the Malones were not in the habit of throwing weight around, which made the weight more convincing when it was present. The commission ruled in their favor. The water rights were confirmed as documented. Drummond's claim was dismissed. Walking out of the courthouse in the February afternoon, Ruby felt the particular satisfaction of a fight conducted on honest grounds and won on the merits. Abel took her hand as they walked down the courthouse steps. "You put that case together," he said. "That was your work." "It was our water," she said. "Our water and your records and your argument," he said. "I want you to know I know that." She looked at him sideways in the winter light. "You are a very good husband," she said. He smiled. "I had a good example in what to look for." They walked on through Tucson, which smelled of wood smoke and horses and the particular dusty life of a growing territorial town, and Ruby thought about how much had changed in 2 years, and how little the essential things had changed. The honesty between them, the willingness to do the work, the warmth that was still as present and genuine as it had been that first evening on her porch. The spring of 1883 brought several things simultaneously. A late frost that worried the cattle operations for 2 anxious weeks before lifting without real damage, a new contract with the railroad supply network that would increase the ranch's market significantly, and the news that Harrison Cross was retiring to his sister's family in New Mexico and recommending a young man named Davis Holt as his replacement. Ruby had a hand in the Holt appointment. She had been quietly managing more of the ranch's administrative operations for months, and she had worked with Holt when he came on as an assistant, and found him competent, honest, and significantly easier to work with than Cross at his most territorial. She also found it interesting that Cross, on his last day, paused on the way to the door of the ranch office and said to her, "You've been good for this operation, Mrs. Malone," in a tone that was the closest he was going to get to an apology and something more than that. "Thank you, Mr. Cross," she said, and meant it. Henry turned one that September, which was cause for celebration of the domestic kind that Ruby found she loved completely. The small party, the cowboys allowed in to toast the baby's birthday, Abel holding Henry up on his shoulder so the boy could see over all the gathered heads, Henry delighted and loud about it. In the early winter of 1883, on a Sunday evening after Henry was asleep and the house was quiet, and the stove was warm and the outside world was cold and clear, Ruby was sitting reading when Abel came in from the porch and sat across from her and looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to associate with something he wanted to say but was choosing his words for. She set down her book. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about the 60 acres, he said. "And?" "Not about the property question," he said. "I've been thinking about what it meant to you. When you walked in here with that satchel and those records and sat across that desk from me, what that required of you." Ruby looked at him steadily. "It required less than it might have," she said, "because you were fair. I want to make sure you always know that what you brought to this marriage, your work, your land, your mind, the way you run things, that isn't incidental to what we've built. It's central. I don't want you to ever feel like the big ranch swallowed the smaller one." Ruby looked at this man she loved, this honest, steady, fair-minded man who still, after 2 years of shared life and a baby and a courthouse fight, and all the daily accumulation of a life built together, looked at her as though she was someone specific and valuable and worth being precise about. "Abel Malone," she said, "I walked into your ranch with nothing but a satchel and a good argument, and you gave me fair dealing, and somewhere between the contract and the water rights and the feed grain and a year and a half of Saturdays in your mother's ring, I also got a life I did not expect and do not deserve and am deeply grateful for." She paused. "I don't feel swallowed. I feel expanded." He looked at her. The stove clicked quietly in the warm room. "Good," he said. "That's the right feeling." She picked up her book. After a moment she looked over the top of it and said, "I think we should have another baby." He looked up from the harness he had been mending. After a beat he said, "I think that is a very good idea." Their second child arrived in the fall of 1884, another boy, strong and loud, who they named James after Abel's grandfather, and who had his mother's coloring and his father's stubbornness about getting what he wanted, which they decided was probably going to serve him well in the territory. Henry, at 2, received the news of a baby brother with the philosophical equanimity of a toddler who had been told something was happening and had not yet understood what it meant, and then with the energetic joy of a child who had found the best toy in the house. Life on the Malone ranch in the mid-1880s was not without its challenges. The beef market fluctuated with the unsettling unpredictability of all commodity markets, and there were seasons when the margins were thin, and the decisions about which cattle to sell and which to hold required the kind of nerve and judgment that kept Abel in the office late. There were disputes with neighboring operations, and the slow bureaucratic grind of territorial governance, and the ever-present question of water in a dry land. The Texas fever came through in 1884, and they lost 14 head before they managed to contain it, which was a loss but not a catastrophe, partly because Ruby had read about the quarantine methods being used in Kansas, and had insisted on implementing them before the fever was confirmed rather than after. It was also, in the sustained and genuine way that seems less dramatic in the living than in the telling, a very happy life. Ruby loved the ranch in a way she had not expected to love it when she first came down that road with borrowed horse and leather satchel. She loved the physical fact of it, the enormous sky and the red earth and the cottonwoods along the creek and the smell of good horse and good leather, and the morning light coming over the eastern ridge. She loved the work, which was real and consequential and varied, and never exactly the same 2 days running. She loved the community of it, the cowboys who had become familiar and in some cases genuinely dear to her, the neighboring families, the web of connection that made the isolation of ranch life something other than loneliness. She also loved Abel Malone with a depth and certainty that had grown rather than diminished with time, which she had heard was how it was supposed to go, but had not been certain she believed until it was happening to her. He was a better man than he perhaps knew. He was steadier in a crisis than he appeared in ordinary times, more generous in his judgments of people than his quiet manner suggested, capable of a tenderness that he expressed in practical rather than performative ways, and that she had learned to read perfectly. She told him this on a particular evening in the late spring of 1885, when they were sitting on the porch of the main house watching the sun go down over the western pasture in a spectacular wash of red and gold that the territory specialized in, with Henry on the step between them and James asleep on a blanket at her feet. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I walked into this ranch 3 years ago owing a debt I wasn't sure I could pay," she said. "And every practical thing has worked out better than I had any right to expect. But the thing that has worked out best has nothing to do with the cattle or the land or the water rights." He looked at her. The evening light was magnificent around them. "You," she said simply, "that has been the unexpected thing. You have been the thing I did not know I was walking toward." Abel was quiet for a moment in the way she knew meant he was feeling something he wanted to say correctly. "You know what I've thought about," he said. "I've thought about what would have happened if I'd been like Cross about that contract. If I'd just said 38 head or the cash equivalent and shown you to the door." "You wouldn't have," Ruby said. "It wasn't in you." "Maybe not," he said, "but someone else might have been in my chair that day, and you would have found another way through because that's who you are. But I am so glad it was me." Ruby looked at him and felt the truth of it, all of it, the whole complicated, ordinary, extraordinary thing that their life had become. "So am I," she said. Henry looked up at both of them with the alert curiosity of a nearly 3-year-old who sensed something important was happening even if he didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. He reached up and patted Ruby's knee, which was his way. She picked him up and settled him in her lap, and Abel reached across and put his hand over hers, and the evening light poured over the ranch they had built together, and James stirred in his blanket and made a small sound of sleepy satisfaction. And the cattle were in their pasture, and the horses were in their corral, and the stars were beginning to appear above the western ridge, one by one, in the enormous Arizona sky. 3 years before this, Ruby Brenner had ridden 12 miles on a borrowed horse to the biggest ranch in the territory with a satchel of records and a problem to solve, and she had solved it, and she had also, without knowing it, which is how the best things happen, found a direction she had not known she was looking for. Abel Malone had looked at a woman across his father's desk and found something no contract had ever specified and no ledger had any category for. Fair dealing, he had said that first morning, and he had meant it as a principle of business, and it had turned out to mean everything else as well. The evening deepened over the ranch, and the night came on full and starlit and warm, and the territory was everything it was, rough and beautiful and indifferent and vast, and in a wide porched house on 12,000 acres of red earth range land, 2 people who had found each other in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday over an extraordinary piece of paperwork held their children and held their lives and were, in the complete and permanent way, home. In the years that followed, the ranch grew in the steady and honest fashion of an operation well run by people who understood both the land and each other. Abel expanded the horse program, which had always been secondary to the cattle business, but which Ruby saw clearly had a larger market than they were reaching. And she was right. And by 1887, the Malone horses were selling as far as the military installation at Fort Huachuca and the railroad staging stations south of Tucson. Henry started school in the fall of 1886, riding in with old Pete on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and came home with opinions about everything that made Abel laugh and Ruby have long conversations about the nature of education and the difference between learning facts and learning to think. James, younger and more physical in his energies, was already the unofficial assistant foreman of any operation that happened within his sight line, directing cattle and chickens and visiting dogs with the same unquestionable authority. In 1887, Davis Holt got married to a woman named Clara, not Abel's sister, a different Clara who had come to the territory with her family from Ohio, and Ruby and Abel attended the wedding and danced together in the way they had been dancing at every gathering since that first night at the Granthams, which was to say well and with obvious enjoyment, and with the particular ease of two people who have long since stopped wondering how the other is going to move. At the wedding, someone who did not know them asked how they had met, and Abel said we met at a business meeting over a difficult contract, and Ruby said he read it more carefully than he had to, and everything followed from that. And the questioner seemed to find this insufficient as a romantic origin story, and Abel and Ruby looked at each other with the private amusement of people who know that the real story is always more than the summary. Late that same year, Ruby discovered she was expecting again. This third pregnancy was also uncomplicated, and in the spring of 1888 they welcomed a daughter. They named her Margaret, after the grandmother on Ruby's side who had been, by all accounts Ruby had received, a woman of unusual practical intelligence and considerable stubbornness, which seemed appropriate. Margaret arrived into a household that was well prepared for her and received her with enthusiasm. Henry, at 5, was immediately protective in the way of small boys who have just discovered something smaller than themselves. James, at 3, needed a few days to adjust, and then decided Margaret was an interesting new development in the ongoing project of the ranch. Abel held his daughter in the first hour of her life with the same expression he had worn holding Henry and James, that particular and complete openness, that a person usually keeps more guarded, and Ruby watched him from her pillow and felt, as she had felt at various moments across 6 years of shared life, the specific and undiminishing gratitude of knowing exactly where you are and wanting to be exactly there. The Arizona Territory moved toward statehood through the slow gears of politics that always seemed to move at a pace inversely related to the urgency of the people waiting. The Malone Ranch had votes in that conversation by virtue of its size and history, and Abel exercised his civic voice in the same fashion. He did everything deliberately and without drama, with a clear eye for what was fair and what was not. One thing Abel and Ruby were both clear about was the injustice being done to the Apache and other native peoples throughout the territory during these years. The forced removals, the broken treaties, the way the government systematically dismantled what little had been left of sovereign life. These were realities that played out on and around the very land they worked, and they did not look away from them. Abel had a long-standing arrangement with several Apache families who had lived on the land long before the Malones arrived, allowing them to pass through and water their horses at the ranch's creek without interference. And he maintained this quietly and without seeking recognition for it, because it was the right thing and not the notable thing. Ruby shared this view and added her own practical contributions when she could. There were winters when food was short, and she directed feed stores toward those families without ceremony. It was not enough. No individual act of fairness was enough against the machinery of injustice operating at a governmental scale, and both Abel and Ruby knew this and lived with the discomfort of it honestly. But they did what they could, in the real and immediate ways available to them, and they taught their children to see the humanity of everyone who worked the same land, and to understand that the history of who got what and how was not a simple story. Henry, who grew into a thoughtful boy who asked questions that sometimes made his father pause, had the kind of moral curiosity that suggested he would spend his life trying to make things more fair than he found them, which was not the worst legacy a person could leave. The ranch celebrated its 40th year in operation in 1889, and Ruby organized an event for it that brought together every person who worked or had worked the Malone operation going back as far as records and memory allowed. And it was the largest gathering the ranch had ever hosted, with tables set out across the yard and fires going and music and food, and the accumulated warmth of all those years of work represented in the faces of people who had done it. Abel gave a speech that evening, standing on the porch with the firelight over the crowd, and he spoke about his father and about what the ranch had been built on and what it still stood for. And then he looked at Ruby standing beside him and said, "And the best thing that has happened to this ranch in my time running, it walked in through that gate 6 years ago asking for a fair price on a debt, and everything I've tried to do since then has been to be worthy of that." There was applause and there was laughter, and Ruby, who did not cry easily, had to look away at the fire-lit sky for a moment. Later that night, after the boys were in their beds and Margaret was asleep in her crib, and the last of the guests had ridden home under the September stars, Ruby and Abel sat on the porch in the quiet and the warmth of two people at the center of a life they had made on honest ground. "You didn't have to say that," Ruby said, "in the speech." "I say true things," he said. "You say more true things in public than most men do in private." He looked at her with the look she knew so well by now, steady, direct, warm, without performance. "You've made this place into what it should have always been," he said. "I want people to know that." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the dark ranch in its nighttime quiet, the outlines of the corrals, the silver thread of the creek, the enormous sky full of its usual spectacular indifference. And she thought about that day in 1882, the borrowed horse and the leather satchel and the gate and the earnest young Eli running to find the right person, and Harrison Cross with his ledger and his mustache. And then Abel coming around the corner of the equipment barn with the particular walk of a man who knew his ground. She had asked for a fair price. She had received more than fair and known it from the moment he opened his mouth, and the more than fair had turned out to be the whole rest of her life, given generously and received in kind. "Abel," she said. "Ruby," he said. She looked up at him and he was already looking at her, and they were both smiling in the dark. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "Still, more, always." The night was warm and full of stars, and the ranch was quiet, and their children were asleep, and the territory went on being vast and rough and beautiful around them. And they sat together on the porch of the home they had built and were, in every way that mattered, completely and truly home. Margaret made her first real word known in October of 1889, which was water, pronounced with tremendous authority for a 1-year-old. And from that point on, she pursued language with the same energy her brother James pursued cattle, which was to say with absolute commitment and total disregard for obstacles. By the time she was 2, she was conducting extended conversations with whoever would hold still long enough, and her favorite audience was her father, who listened to her with the same full attention he brought to important business. Henry, at 7, had become interested in the territorial newspaper and read it with more comprehension than most adults gave him credit for. He asked Abel questions about land laws and water rights that led to the best conversations either of them had had in a while, and Abel answered honestly, including the parts of the answers that were complicated and not entirely satisfactory, because he did not believe in shielding children from complexity. James, at 5, had decided that the horses were his primary domain and showed a talent for working with them that made the horse doctor, a man named Soren who had replaced the previous one 2 years earlier, observed that the boy had a natural feel for it that was not entirely teachable and might be worth cultivating. Ruby was 34 in 1889, which in the territory was not old but was not young either. It was the age at which people who had worked hard in hard circumstances began to wear the evidence of it, but she was healthy and strong, and the evidence she wore was the kind that suits a person. The lines around her eyes that came from looking at bright distances, the particular quality of her hands that came from good work, the steadiness of someone who has been tested and found their own substance. She was also, in 1889, happier than she had any logical right to be given how the decade had started, which she considered every so often, and then let herself simply be grateful for. The 1890s arrived with the territory's ongoing argument about its future, and the ranch's ongoing engagement with the question of how to adapt to a changing market and a changing landscape. The cattle business was both more and less reliable than it had been more infrastructure, more market access, but also more competition and more volatility in prices as the whole American beef economy went through its various national convulsions. Abel navigated it with the steady intelligence that had always characterized how he managed things, and Ruby was beside him in the management in a way that had long since ceased to be anything but completely natural. She handled the administrative and contractual side of the operation with the precision that had always been her strength, and they made decisions together in the even-handed way of partners who respected each other's judgment. Davis Holt continued as general manager and was good at it, and his wife Clara, the Ohio Clara, became over time a genuine friend to Ruby in the way that women friends on the territory were practical, direct, built on the shared experience of making difficult things work rather than on the social conventions that governed such friendships in easier circumstances. It was Clara who was present in 1891 when Ruby lost a pregnancy early, before she had told anyone she was expecting. It was the only significant medical difficulty of those years, and it was mourned quietly and privately. And then they went on, because going on is what people do, and because they had 3 living children and a good life, and gratitude was not incompatible with grief. Abel was present in the way he was always present during difficult things, wholly, without fuss, giving exactly what was needed and not more. He sat with her through the worst of it and did not try to explain or minimize, and did not leave when the silence was heavy, and Ruby thought that the truest thing you could know about a person was who they were when things were hard. She knew Abel Malone all the way through. By 1893, Henry was 10 years old and already more capable than most adults gave him credit for, and Margaret was 5 and had opinions about everything in the universe, and James was 8 and had the horse management of the ranch largely organized according to his own private system. The family moved through the days of the ranch in the busy, overlapping, loving chaos of a household with children and working land and the constant press of the real world. And Ruby found this chaos not exhausting, but nourishing the evidence of life going on, fully and with force. One afternoon in the fall of that year, Ruby was in the ranch office doing the quarter's accounts when Henry came in and sat in the visitor's chair across the desk from her and said, in the precise, careful manner of a child who has been rehearsing, "Mama, why did you come to this ranch the first time?" Ruby set down her pen and looked at her eldest son. "I needed to settle a debt," she said. "Papa told me he gave you a better deal than he had to," Henry said. "Walt told me that's what started it." Ruby considered Walt for a moment, who was now one of the senior cowboys and apparently also a historian of family events. "Your father read the contract carefully and decided that fair was more important than profitable," she said. Henry thought about this with the focused seriousness of a 10-year-old working through an important idea. "Is that why you love him?" Ruby smiled. "It's one of the reasons. It was the first thing I noticed." Henry nodded, turning this over. "That's a good reason," he said in the tone of someone filing information. "It is," Ruby agreed. Henry went back out to whatever he had been doing, satisfied, and Ruby sat for a moment at the desk that had been Abel's father's and then Abel's, and was now substantially hers as well, in this house that had been the Malone family's and was now also the Brenner Malone family's, in this territory that was still rough and still vast and still, in the particular early autumn light, so beautiful it made you want to stand still and just look at it. She thought about the borrowed horse and the leather satchel. She thought about the gate and the gate hand and Harrison cross with his ledger. She thought about Abel coming around the corner of the equipment barn. And she picked up her pen and went back to the accounts, because there was work to do and she had always been a woman who did the work. And the work was good, and the life was good, and everything that had come from that one morning in 1882 was still unfolding in the fine and ordinary and extraordinary way of all things built on honest ground. Outside, she could hear Abel in the yard, talking to James about something to do with the horses, and James answering with his usual authoritative certainty, and then Abel's laugh, that sudden, genuine laugh that had not changed in 11 years, and then Margaret's voice demanding to know what was funny, and then the general happy noise of her family in the afternoon of a good day. Ruby Brenner Malone set down her pen again, just for a moment, and listened. And she smiled. The territory went on around her, enormous and red and bright, the sky its usual improbable blue, the ranch in its daily rhythms of work and life, the creek running clear along the property line where the cottonwoods whispered in the afternoon breeze, and the gate at the end of the long road standing open as it had always stood open under Abel's management, because that was the standard practice of this ranch, and always had been and always would be. Fair dealing. More than fair. Everything that mattered.